Good evening, everyone. Thankful for you tuning in and being a part of our daily devotional series as we are continuing our study from last week concerning what love is. And if you've been, hopefully, you've been tuning in, being a part of these. If not, maybe you've had a couple of days to catch up. As we took a couple of days off at the end of the week last week, just to kind of give you everybody a break and maybe give you an opportunity to catch up. If you haven't, this comes out of 1 Corinthians 13, the idea of this description of love that Paul writes. And we've talked about, we started outside of 1 Corinthians 13 with the idea of love beginning with listening, the idea that it's just something that we don't do. For whatever reason, we just don't do it. We don't listen. We, most of the time, are listening to respond rather than listening to actually listen, to pay attention, to learn something. Or to empathize, or to try and help. We're too busy coming up with whatever we're going to say next. And it's very selfish of us to operate in that way. Then we began with 1 Corinthians 13. If you remember, we read pretty much the entire chapter, that first lesson we talked about, in verse 4, where Paul says love is patient, love is kind. And then we talked about some things that love is not. It's not rude, it's not boastful, it's not... There's so many things that love can be described as being, but there's also equally a number of things that Paul goes out of his way, even more so, maybe perhaps than things that love is. He says, now, wait a minute, you got to make sure you understand what it's not. It allows you to better value and to better understand what it is. So this is one of those times where he said, love does not insist on its own way. Love does not insist on its own way. Now, when you look at some of the things that he said there, if you go back, open your Bible, 1 Corinthians 13, hopefully you've got it right there in front of you. If you go back and you look, a lot of these things kind of sound similar. So for instance, in verse 4, he starts with to love is patient and kind. Then he goes to love does not envy or boast. It's not arrogant or rude. And then you have it does not insist on its own way. That handful of things there, those 5 things, truthfully, are very similar in nature. But today, what we want to look at just briefly is this idea of insisting on our own way. I want to go to an Old Testament example, then a New Testament example, and I want to see if we can sort of take something from that. But remember, here's what we're trying to focus on. This is what we're trying to grasp. This is what we're trying to hold on to. And that is that in a culture in which we're living, a society in which we're living, the world in which we're living, the community in which we're living, we need to show the love of Christ to every single person we come in contact with. It sounds cliche and it sounds oversimplified. Maybe it is. But it would heal a lot of the problems that are jumping up and facing us. And not just us, but for generations to come, that they're going to have to deal with. Love, but not just any kind of love. Not just, ooey gooey, Valentine's Day, I bought you a gift kind of love. Not that. We're talking about the love of Christ, which was something much more rooted in not just feelings or emotions, but it was rooted in an understanding of the desire of God, the creator of the universe. The idea of the love of Christ is rooted deeply in the concept of creation. It's what God intended. And there's so much to take from that. But basically, for the world that we're living in, it's needed. There's not a lot of it, to be quite honest. When you look around, it doesn't feel like there's a lot of it. Let me just say it that way. And so that's what we're trying to grasp and hold on to. Okay, so we're talking about love does not insist on its own way. Go to 2 Chronicles chapter 10. 2 Chronicles chapter 10. This is there's a couple places where this is mentioned specifically. This is one of them. 2 Chronicles chapter 10. Now, Rehoboam is put in charge. Okay, and he is the son of Solomon. If you remember a couple of weeks ago on Father's Day, maybe 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 now, getting close to 3, we talked about in our Sunday morning lesson, we discussed the concept of what a father is, and we used Solomon as an example because we said he mentioned so many things in Proverbs 4 that were great concepts. Great challenges for young people, for a son to learn from his father. for what it means to be a father. Okay? All of those things he then undid by his own decisions and his own doings. I mean, the things that he did, the drastic falling away that he went through, undid so many of those things that he was trying to teach and promote within his children. So this is an example of that. This is an example of the aftermath. Once Solomon has died, Rehoboam now is in charge. And there's some folks that come to him in verse 4 of 2 Chronicles chapter 10. And they say, look, your father was rough on us. He was rough on us. Now, if you'll kind of back off just a little bit, we're not asking you for anything crazy, but if you'll lighten the service of your father, verse 4, and his heavy yoke on us, we will serve you. And Rehoboam sort of takes that under consideration and says, okay, give me a couple of 3 days. Let me think about this. And he goes to some of the older men who had been with Solomon, who had seen the error of his ways. And Rehoboam says, okay, what do you guys think I should do? And they said, look, here's the bottom line. Your father made some really bad decisions and some mistakes. And here's you a chance to fix those. If you'll lighten their load, if you'll be a benevolent boss, then here's what you're going to notice. They're going to be so loyal that they'll do anything you want them to, and they'll be willing to work even harder, maybe perhaps than you expect, if you'll show them some mercy. Then he goes to people from his generation, friends of his, those in his circle, ask them the same question, what should I do? And they said, no, here's what you got to do. If you do anything but ramp it up to a whole new level of ruling with an iron fist, so to speak, they're gonna revolt against you. So you are going to have to take a stand and be rough, and you're going to have to be harder on them than your father ever thought about being. And unfortunately, that's the advice that he takes. And if you notice, what ends up happening is there is a revolt. Now, let me just briefly try to make some sense of this and what we're talking about. Love does not insist on its own way. Here's the opportunity that most of us have. Let's talk application. There's a lot of opportunities in our lives, specifically maybe in our marriages and dealing with our children, and maybe even to a lesser degree in our jobs, where we have an opportunity to maybe, for lack of a better term, take a stand for, I want it done this way, I think this is right, and if I think this is right, then you should think it's right, and if you don't think it's right, well, then you can just take a walk because I am right. And the other side is trying to explain perhaps maybe, well, have you thought about it this way? And a lot of times what we choose to do is we choose to say, but I want what I want, and I want it the way that I want it. And unfortunately, a lot of times what ends up happening is we wind up finding ourselves alone, kind of on an island, because what we've done is we've pushed everybody else away. I can speak to that. I've done that, unfortunately, and I feel horrible about those instances when I can think back to when that's happened. I'll give you sort of a less important, silly example. There was a time when we were on vacation a couple of years ago, and we were driving, and my wife said, looks like she had her phone pulled up. She said, looks like on here there's some bad traffic coming. My phone is saying, why don't you get off at this exit? It's going to take a little bit longer, but you'll stay out of traffic, and you'll be able to get kind of around that traffic. And I remember kind of taking my stand, right, and saying, no, my phone tells me, and I know for a fact that, you know what, it usually says there's traffic, and there's really not. It's all sort of a little game that they play, and they try to let you know. And so, I mean, I acted downright, as I would say with my children, I downright acted ugly about it. Well, as you would probably guess, we got to the traffic jam, and when we did, we waited an hour. And instead of making one little exit, a couple of turns, and maybe taking 10 minutes out of my way, it was an hour and a half out of my way to sit in that traffic. And I remember everybody in the vehicle sort of looking at me as the clock would tick by and we would creep along the interstate. I remember thinking, well, you got what you wanted. You took your stand. You really put everybody in here in their place. And now you look kind of silly. For Rehoboam, it's much more serious than that. I mean, truthfully, he ends up having to do some things that are horrific to even maintain his hold on the kingdom. And it all comes back to, look, he never listened I said, look, we've been through hard times. We've been through a king who holds us down and beats us up. We've been through that. Hey, that didn't work. And he said, no, but I want it my way, and I want it the way that I want it, and I want it right now. Let's look at the opposite of that, and this is in the New Testament. You go to John chapter 3. John chapter 3. John the Baptist was a guy who had everything going for him, to be quite honest with you. He is the show to see early on. I mean, he is the show to see. When people look to the early points of the gospel message, I mean, John the Baptist is the guy. And for about 6 months, give or take, he is the only guy. I mean, he is the main event. He's the main attraction. He's what everybody's coming to see. And he baptizes Jesus. He even is given that opportunity by Jesus himself. You know, let this be done so that Scripture can be fulfilled. So John, hey, I need you to do this for me. And John is, you know, sort of taken aback by that. So if there was anybody that wanted to maybe kind of stamp his foot and raise his fist and say, look, but I've done all this work, I deserve, it would be John. I mean, he would be the guy. And instead, when you look at John chapter 3, you get over to verse 25. John had been baptizing at Anon near Salim because the water was plentiful and people were coming to be baptized. John had not yet been put in prison. John, the author, John tells us. A discussion arose between some of John's disciples, verse 25, and a Jew over purification. When they came to John, they said, Rabbi, he who was with you across the Jordan, to whom you bore witness, look, he is baptizing and all are going to him. And John answered, a person cannot receive even one thing unless it is given him from heaven. You yourselves bear me witness that I said, I'm not the Christ, but I've been sent before him. The one who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. Therefore, this joy of mine, listen to these words, this joy of mine is now complete. He must increase, but I must decrease. What a beautiful picture of humility. What a beautiful picture of love. What a beautiful picture of love. As John the Baptist looked at Jesus and he said, look, that's the one. He has to keep going and it's time for me to take a back seat. What a beautiful picture that is. And it's why John is so highly thought of, even by Jesus when he's, when the disciples of John come and they ask, are you the one or should we wait for another? And Jesus says, you go tell John, the lame walk, the blind see, the deaf hear, the good news is being preached to the poor. And after they leave, Jesus turns and he says, look, there's nobody on earth that comes close to John. It's why Jesus is quick to promote John the Baptist anytime his name is brought up. It's because John the Baptist truly understood what it means to love. He understood what it meant to love. He didn't insist on his own way. He loved humbly. He loved with empathy, and he loved his fellow man. And he wanted them to all come to know the real Messiah, the real Christ, the chosen one of God. That should be who we are. Our lives should be centered around showing other people love because we want them to come to know Jesus Christ more than anything else on this planet. Let that be a challenge to you. Hope that you have a wonderful evening. We'll continue our study and hope that you'll be a part of that tomorrow evening.